Welcome back to Proxy, everybody, and today we're going to be diving into the Reaper's Wager once again and looking at where the Druhkari and Harlequin units fall on a tier list. So I thought it'd be interesting to do something like this just because the Reaper's Wager is such a unique detachment. It's very different than the other two Dark Eldar detachments, and there's a lot more synergies and buffs and just all sorts of stuff that the Reaper's Wager brings. In fact, I think the Reaper's Wager alone is far and above the most beneficial detachment to every single Druhkari Eldar unit in the entire index, as well as several Harlequin units. And to be frank, the other two detachments leave a lot to be desired for the Dark Eldar, in that they're not really friendly with all the models in the index. So, having said that, my opinion on the Reaper's Wager is that it is the best detachment in the entire lineup for the Druhkari. Yes, the other detachments have their strengths, but I think that this one is overall the best pick. And there's a number of reasons why. One, I think that, just like I said before, the unit diversity that you can select with this detachment is amazing. Almost every unit on the roster is better than it would be in a Sky Splinter or Real Space Raid, with a couple of exceptions, but not many, to be honest. The other thing is, it has some great stratagems that really buff a lot of units, and in fact, I think that several of the Harlequin units are better in this Druhkari detachment than in the Eldari army itself. And that may come as a shock to some of you, but I do think there's a couple of units that are actually better with the Druhkari than the Eldari. So having said that, I have played a couple of games with this detachment now, and honestly, my predictions are pretty much spot on. This is a very powerful detachment. It has some very powerful combos. It does take a little bit to get used to in an actual game, flipping the wager back and forth. I did make a couple of errors early on in the game with this, especially when things get dicey later in the game. You start forgetting stuff, you forget to flip the wager, you forget the reroll. It's going to happen your first couple of games, but despite those mistakes, the detachment felt really powerful. And it actually felt like every single unit in my army was effective. There was no quote-unquote trash in my list. Of course, there was the units that I would use to sacrifice for secondary objectives and stuff like that, but it truly did feel as if every unit had a role to play. So, having said that, let's start from the top with the Archon. Now, the Archon is pretty much an auto-include in most detachments, and I don't actually believe the Archon's an auto-include in this one, but I do think he is very good, and I am going to put the Archon in A tier. Now, we have seen a points increase from the Archon. We have seen a limit of the Archon's ability to reduce or increase the CP cost within 12 inches of enemy units for stratagems and stuff like that. But it's still a very good pick. I think it's extremely strong with Incubi coming out of a Raider, being able to do lethal hits, sustained hits, also on top of rerolls to hit with a pain token and rerolls to wound. Because of the Archon's presence, make Incubi hit extremely hard, especially against hard targets. That's not something you'll see even in Sky Splinter. And a lot of people go, well, Incubi are much better in Sky Splinter. And we'll talk about Incubi in a second. And I do think the Archon itself may be better in Sky Splinter, but I actually do believe that the combination is just as good in this detachment as it is in Sky Splinter, with the Archon, Incubi, and a Venom. And again, I'll get into more of that when we talk about Incubi. But the Archon himself, still really strong. I think he's A tier, obviously. The only downside to the Archon really is that he doesn't hit that hard himself. In this particular detachment, not having Lance is a little bit tough, because that means if you're going against anything that is not infantry, he's not going to hit very hard. He's going to be still wounding on 5s, even with a reroll, right? So that is a little bit of an iffy proposition, which is why he's not S tier. And if you're wondering why I'm saying this, basically, the Archon has a strength 3, anti-infantry 3+ weapon. If you're not charging into infantry in Sky Splinter, strength 3 with +1 to wound is actually much better than Strength 3 with rerolls of 1s to wound, or rerolls, whatever that this detachment has, right? Even with lethal hits, the Archon really doesn't hit that hard against anything but infantry. But still a great model, still great to lead Incubi, and also Kabbalite Warriors. I've actually used him to lead Kabbalite Warriors, and with great success, to be real with you guys. He's really good. But I just don't think he's as good with Incubi himself, just himself alone in this detachment as, in the Sky Splinter. But I do think the Incubi are just as good in this detachment, if not better, than in Sky Splinter, if that makes sense. Okay, that's the Archon. He's A tier. Now let's talk about Drazhar. Drazhar is also a extremely good character, and I actually, after using him today, he's S tier in this detachment. Why do I think that? Well, first of all, his weapons are really strong, but the problem is he doesn't get rerolls to wound, right? That's his quote-unquote downside. But he does get +1 to wound with his Incubi. So, what you do is you hop him up with a pain token, so you're getting rerolls to hit. You can, of course, give him lethal hits or sustained hits with a stratagem. Incubi as well. And then, with +1 to wound, this guy is going to wound most things on it too. So he's getting full rerolls to wound, just as if you were in a Sky Splinter detachment. And again, Sky Splinter, he's kind of redundant in Sky Splinter in a lot of ways. And in this detachment, he's actually really strong because he benefits from the rerolls to wound of 1. So he's just kind of amazing, right? He has devastating wounds on one of his weapons. The other weapon, the other mode is, twin linked, but you don't really need that. I think the dev wounds is much better. So you can fish for dev wounds, wounding on a 2+, and this means that oftentimes he's just going to slaughter enemy characters outright and grant you a bunch of extra pain tokens for doing so. He can also hit vehicles harder than normal because he is strength 6, he is getting +1 to wound, he is rerolling wound rolls of 1, and on top of that you can give him lethal hits if you want to. And, in some cases, you're going to be just absolutely wrecking vehicles with Incubi and Drazhar. So I do think Drazhar is extremely good. I actually had Drazhar and a unit of Incubi charge into a Ballistus Dreadnought and absolutely wipe it off the field. So yes, he can take out tanks, even with strength 6. You have that +1 to wound. You're wounding on a 4+. You throw lethal hits on him. Enough said with rerolls, right? I was doing so much damage. It was insane. So yeah, I think Drazhar in this detachment is definitely an S tier unit, just because of the fact he doesn't have to rely as much on infantry units like the Archon does. And he's the same cost as the Archon. He's also slightly more durable. In most cases, I know the Archon has the Shadow Field for 2+ invul, but in my experience, usually fail this in a couple dice rolls, and then it's bye-bye Archon. With Drazhar, you got an extra wound, you got a 2+ base save, and you got a 4+ invul, so it's a little bit more consistent. Okay. Let's go ahead and talk about the Succubus. So the Succubus is A tier. Now, again, crazy, right? Because in most detachments, a Succubus isn't that good. In fact, I would rate the Succubus as one of the least effective combat characters in the entire game. However, the Succubus is really cheap, and in this particular detachment, because when she's attached to witches, she gives them sustained hits 1 and fights first, with the stratagem of lethal hits, witches all of a sudden no longer have a problem wounding their targets, especially with rerolls to hit via a pain token. So, for the same reason that I love Wind Riders, that you can double up on lethal hits with Shroud Runners and sustained hits 1 with the Wind Riders ability, or Shuriken Cannons basically, you can do the same thing with a Witch unit for an extremely low cost. A Succubus is 45 points, witches are 90 points, that's 135 points, and they will outtrade almost any Marine equivalent unit when hopped up on a pain token, and of course given the stratagem lethal hits, which is insanely strong. And basically what you do here is you just fish for 6s, right? You roll all your dice, you set your 6s to the side, you double them with sustained hits, and then you just roll all the misses again. And basically anything that is not a 6, you're going to want to reroll. And then once that happens, you're going to get a ton of lethal hits out of it. You're going to get a ton of sustained hits, which are then going to roll to normally, but you are going to be striking at AP -2. And the Succubus itself is pretty good as well. Anti-infantry 3+, again, it does have a problem against things that aren't infantry, but the witch units, unlike the Incubi, are going to want to go strictly after infantry. You don't want to bother with tanks with these girls. You want to straight up go against infantry and wipe them out for that low cost. They're very efficient, and you get a lot of wounds there. And honestly, yeah, I think it's a great kind of unit. And I really do think it epitomizes the detachment bonus itself. Rerolls 1s to wound as well. I forgot to mention that, right? It's just really strong. You got a unit that can get out of a transport 3 inches, move 8 inches, advance, possibly with a reroll to advance because of the pain token ability. And then on top of that, you can shoot and charge because of the stratagem. So yeah, it's a lot of CP, but it's a huge threat range, and it's with a unit that can grant itself fights first, which is really strong in a lot of situations and scenarios. Okay, so the Succubus is good. What about Lelith? Well, she's even better. I think Lelith is just amazing herself because she has sustained hits too. She doesn't even need a unit of witches to be with her because she is so strong by herself. You give her lethal hits and she's going to town on basically anything she hits. She's a one-woman wrecking crew. And again, she's like this in other detachments as well. There's not much directly that this detachment does except give her rerolls 1s to wound, which is still really good. And of course, the lethal hit stratagem, which allows her to hit, you know, a little bit higher against other stuff, right? If you really need her to hit something that's not infantry, like bikes or, you know, beasts or something like that, she can do it. She's not so good against vehicles, but she is good against things with, you know, 1 or 2 wounds maybe, and kind of, you know, lowish defensive stats, you know, lowish AP and stuff like that. She can really hit them really hard. Lowish armor, I meant. Lowish armor. She can really hit them very, very hard and just wipe them out. So she's really good as well, and she has base fights first, of course, which is conferred to her unit if she's with a unit of witches as well. Okay. Next up, we have Urian Rakarth. Urian's okay. I would rate him B tier. Now, the reason for this, I've used this guy a couple times in my games, and I don't know if I'm just not using him to the fullest of his potential, but he just doesn't seem to really do anything. When he's a solo character, I feel like he does have that revive, so, you know, he has basically the Fuegan ability where he can get up on a 2+, which is nice, but he doesn't really do much other than that. He can revive a couple wounds on a Kronos or a Talos, which is nice. But if he's moving up the field with the Kronos and Talos, chances are he's going to be in a vulnerable position. And oftentimes he just ends up being a liability. He's an 85-point unit that is essentially a glorified tech priest, and he just doesn't have what a tech priest does. Doesn't give Talos or Incubi, or excuse me, Kronos or Talos what a tech priest would give a vehicle. So yeah, I put him in B tier. He does have the revivability, but in my experience, it's just not that good. Feel free though in the comment section to let me know how you like Urian Rakarth. I personally don't like him. He's been kind of a stinker for me in my games, but you know, let me know, and I'd be more than happy to be wrong. Okay, next up is the Homunculus, and same thing here with the Homunculus. Just not great. Actually, I'm going to put the Homunculus in C tier. I think the Homunculus is even worse than Urian because really doesn't do much, gives his unit a 4+ feel no pain. Racks are just meant to die anyway, so you don't really care about them too much. I know racks are cheaper now with the new balance data slate that came out, but racks are still not that good. I think that racks are probably one of the lesser units. They're decent for just chucking on an objective, dying, getting a pain token. I totally understand that. I just don't value them at their points worth usually. Again, that's just my personal preference. I know that most armies are going to need at least 1 unit of racks in it, but I found myself doing fine without the racks, honestly, in this detachment because you have so many potential things that can cause battle shock tests that I found myself not really needing the racks for anything. So, yeah, Obviously, Homunculus is just basically to be with Rax, essentially, and I just don't see him having a purpose in this detachment whatsoever. Okay, next up is Beast Pack, and Beast Pack is phenomenal. Like always, Beast Pack's great. I know they got a points nerf, but they're still really good. Rerolling charge rolls is really effective. Rerolling wound rolls of 1 is really good. They, get to reroll their hit rolls. Mostly, though, you're taking them for scout. You're taking them for that ability to scout up the battlefield. Now, weirdly enough, and I know this seems like kind of weird, but I'm pretty sure you can actually put one of the enhancements on the Beastmaster himself, which is wild, right? I think you can actually put I want to say the Shadow Field or the Shadow Hood. It's the one that gives you Infiltrate and Stealth. I think you can give it to a Beastmaster because the Beastmaster is a character. Correct me if I'm wrong in the comments, but the Beastmaster is a character, so I think you can give it to him, and that will give the entire unit Stealth and Infiltrate, which is insane with Scouts because they have Scout 9. So, yeah, I think they're amazing. I haven't tried them with the Infiltrate ability, but I guarantee you if you're able to do that, that would be really insane. And I think obviously Beast Packs are just good as is, so, very effective unit there. Okay. Let's talk about the Court of the Archon. So the Court of the Archon is one of the weirder units in the Druhkari Index. Really only good when you attach them to a big unit of warriors, but strangely enough, I actually think that it might be pretty good in this detachment. Now, I'm going to go over why when I talk about the Tantalus. But essentially, there's a combo you can use with these guys that makes a unit of Kabalite warriors with an Archon exceptionally powerful. However, it's a lot of eggs in one basket, and I don't think in most matchups you're going to take something like this, so I'm going to rate them probably B tier. Reason being, I think they're more of a fun unit. I think they're really fun, just like the Tantalus is a fun unit. It's not super competitive, if you brought it to a GT or something like that, it'd probably be a little bit of a liability. But yeah, in semi-competitive games, in your local, maybe an RTT or something like that, you can definitely get some good matchups with them. A Court of the Archon with an Archon and a unit of Kabbalite warriors are getting lethal hits, just base because of the Court of the Archon. They're potentially getting sustained hits because of the stratagem. They're getting a good amount of combat ability. They can jump out of the Tantalus if they want to and go forward, or the Tantalus itself can be, pain tokened up, and these guys can be, and inside of the Tantalus can be given lethal hits with a stratagem. There's a lot of powerful combinations that they can be a part of. Unfortunately, I just think it's too expensive. This is, I believe they're 85 points, so they're not cheap. And on top of the cost for an Archon, on top of the cost for the Tantalus and the Warriors, you're kind of looking at a Death Star. You're looking at a Dark Eldar version of a Death Star, and it's a little too expensive for the fragility, I think. But they are pretty good, and that's why I kind of rate them in B tier, because I haven't used them, but that doesn't mean that people haven't been able to use them with some success in, more casual or semi-competitive games. I think there is a place for them in most, casual or even, RTT settings. I think there could be a place for them. Okay, moving on to Reavers. Reavers are one of my favorite units in Ynnari, and they're pretty good in this detachment as well. I don't rate them as good as in Ynnari, though. I would put them, honestly, in B tier. I know a lot of you might think no, but I think they're a B tier unit, strictly because the rerolls ones to hit and wound, while good, is not exactly as good as they are in Ynnari, where it's just straight up a reroll to hit and wound instead of rerolls of ones. So there's that. The other thing is their ability doesn't really synergize with anything in this army. So, being able to move over units and do some mortal wounds, not that big of a deal. So, yeah, they're good. I just don't think they're, super good. And especially when for 5 more points, you can have a unit of Mandrakes, can score on objectives and things like that just as well. For 15 less points, you can have a Kronos who can go forward and score on Sabotage, can score on these, secondary objectives that the Reavers would normally be doing. And the Kronos, of course, is much tougher, regenerates pain tokens, actually has decent firepower against infantry, whereas the Reavers just have a single heat lance. So, yeah, that's kind of where I think of Reavers in this detachment. Again, I think Reavers are good. I don't find there to be any problem with them, but I just don't think they're as good in this particular detachment, and I think that there are better units suited for their role. Okay, next up, we have Witches. Guys, I can't believe I'm saying it. Witches are an A tier unit in this detachment. Again, just like what I said before, in this detachment, you give witches lethal hits, you give them access to advanced shoot and charge, just like they have in Real Space Raid, but of course in Real Space Raid they suck because they don't get the rerolls or lethal hits or anything like that, and you're looking at a very powerful unit for a very cheap cost. So yeah, witches A tier, talked about them a little bit before. You can run them in 5-man units, or I would actually suggest running them in a 10-man with a Succubus or with a Lilith in this kind of... Well, actually, I think Lilith is probably better with a 5-man witch unit, but definitely a Succubus with a 10-man witch unit can absolutely murder things. You know, you could even trade up into things like heavy intercessors, or could trade up into things like centurions, you know what I mean? Because they're infantry units, you have lethal hits, you're getting rerolls all hits, you're getting, you know, wound rerolls of 1. Yeah, it's extremely strong for the cost. Let's just put it that way. And again, they're only 135 points for 10 of them. So even if you lose, straight up lose against a unit of Centurions, you know, maybe you only kill 3 of them, they kill back 5 witches, or maybe they kill a little bit more, you have the potential to dodge Overwatch because of the other stratagem in the detachment that allows you to become immune to Overwatch. So again, just tons of things that are just great for witches. So yeah, I think they're very good in this detachment, and gotta put them in A tier because of it. Okay, next up is Hellions. Now, a lot of people hate Hellions, right? Because they can't move through walls, but with advanced shoot and charge, and potentially lethal hits, I have to say, with their new points cost of 75 points for 5, I'm going to go out on a limb here. I tried them today. They absolutely demolished things. They absolutely wrecked. I double charged into 2 5-man units of intercessors. They wiped them out to a man. Consolidated into a vehicle, and continued to punish my opponent even afterward because they are tougher than regular Eldar. Toughness 4 and 2 wounds apiece. So they're extremely... I won't say extremely durable, but they're more durable than a lot of people give them credit for. I think in this detachment, they're S tier. Not only did they make up their points worth in the game that I played with them, but they absolutely continued to be a menace in my opponent's deployment zone. Turn 1, I was able to move forward and charge something deep in my opponent's deployment zone, or not deep in it, but, you know, on the deployment line. Was able to kill 2 Space Marine squads right off the bat, and then consolidate into a vehicle. It made a huge mess of my opponent's plans, and honestly, even if you're not that lucky and your opponent kind of sees that coming beforehand, and my opponent did see it coming, he just didn't think it was that big of a deal because of the reputation that Hellions have, but they're absolutely brilliant in this detachment, and they're not going to let you down, especially with a couple of choice stratagems. In that case, I actually didn't even have lethal hits with them, but they still, amazingly enough, did awesome. So yes, they are very good. They can kill infantry, they can trade up into vehicles and stuff like that with their lethal hits. They're insane. Oh, and by the way, they have sustained hits 1 base. So you don't have to worry about not having sustained hits 1, because you're already going to get that. So you can double up on that, just like you can with the witches I talked about earlier. Okay, Hellions are amazing. Gotta love them in this detachment. Let's talk about the Void Raven Bomber. I think the Void Raven, I'm going to put it in A tier tentatively. I think it's good. I just think it's very iffy. I think it's opponent dependent. Against some opponents, it's going to come in, it's going to kill something and then die to return fire. Against other opponents, because it's a flyer, maybe they have a lot of combat stuff, or maybe they have a lot of short range shooting, they're not going to be able to take it out, and it's going to be able to do great things, especially with the fact that you can give it sustained hits as well on its weapons. So, really powerful, but really expensive. Again, some matchups, it's just not going to be good. Against armies like IG, I could definitely see this thing just flopping hard, not killing its points worth, and then just dying. But against things like Space Wolves, where they don't have a lot of flying units and they don't have a lot of shooting, I could definitely see something like this just ripping things apart piece by piece. So yeah, it's A tier, but tentatively speaking, because there are matchups where it's like probably a C tier unit, it's just not worth taking. But then there are matchups where it's like S tier, God tier basically, despite its points nerfs. Okay, let's talk about the Venom. Venom is just your basic transport. Obviously, we're just going to put this in A tier because it's needed. We use it for units like Witches and Kabalites Warriors and Incubi and stuff like that. It's allows us to get back into a transport after killing a unit. With the Reaper's Wager, this thing is actually better than it is in other detachments. Not surprisingly, a lot of things are better in this detachment than they are in the previous two, the Sky Splinter and the Real Space Raid. So yeah, I rate this in A tier, and when you get rerolls 1s to hit with sustained hits and then rerolls 1s to wound, this thing can actually put out some good damage against Marines and other infantry. Okay, let's talk about the Ravager. So the Ravager I actually think is B tier. It's okay, don't get me wrong. It's not a terrible vehicle, but I just think there's better choices in this detachment. The Ravager gets 3 Dark Lances. Yes, you can give it sustained hits, but it's already getting rerolls 1s to wound because of the wager, or rerolls 1s to hit, excuse me, and the rerolls 1s to wound is nice, but that can be said of pretty much Scourges, that could be said of other things in this detachment, right? So you don't technically need it. I also think the Void Weaver from the Harlequins is actually a better choice for the points over a Ravager. So yeah, I just don't think the Ravager is that great. Basically, moral of the story, bottom line, I don't think it's that great in this detachment because you're kind of doubling up on buffs. You don't have enough Dark Lances to truly make it effective. At least more effective than some of the other things that you can bring to the table in this detachment. So we're going to leave it in B tier for now. But again, let me know what you guys think about this. Personally, I just think it's better in something like Sky Splinter or even Real Space Raid, because in Real Space Raid you have Strike and Fade, and Sky Splinter you have the Night Shield to give a 4+ invulnerable save. So I think those things are a little bit better in that detachment. Okay. Razorwing Jet Fighter, we're going to just put in B tier as well. Fun unit, nothing bad about it, just gets +1 to hit against ground targets that don't fly. It's not terrible, but again, only comes with 2 Dark Lances and a Splinter Cannon and some missiles. Good against infantry, but what infantry is going to be 170 points that you're going to be able to kill, right? You might be able to kill a unit of 5 Marines, especially with the Reaper's Wager bonuses, sustained hits or lethal hits or whatever, but you're not going to be able to do much more than that, and I just feel like at that point, you're better off going with something else. And that's essentially what I think about the Razorwing. Just too expensive for what it does in this detachment, and kind of too expensive for what it does in pretty much any detachment as well. Unlike the Void Raven, which is actually pretty boss in this detachment in certain situations. Next up, we have the Raider. Again, I'm just going to put the Raider in A tier in this one. It's a good transport, can take 10 models. I think, again, it's better in this particular detachment than other detachments. And the reason why I think that is because of the advance and charge stratagem that you can give it. So you can basically advance 6 inches with this, right? So you can have a unit inside, you could advance, and this gets a 6-inch auto advance, so you can move up to 20 inches, and then you can charge something, which is really strong, especially if you can line it up in such a way that it's hidden from enemy shooting the next turn and engaged with a unit that has already been kind of peppered down by the shooting of the squad inside, right? Because it says firing deck. So yeah, I think this is great. I used it in one of my games today. It did perform pretty well. I had, 2 leftover units of Kabalites in it, just splinter rifles, but I was able to use it one turn to, block a charge lane, pepper a unit of Reavers down because my opponent decided to take some Reavers, which I guess are better now, apparently. But, I mean, I didn't notice because I just killed them all. But, yeah, splinter rifles with, advance and shoot and charge is actually pretty fun. And, I don't think it's like the best thing out there, don't get me wrong, but Raiders are a solid transport for sure. Okay, next is the Tantalus, and the Tantalus is B tier. Now, normally I'd put the Tantalus in like C tier because it's really a kind of more of a meme unit. But with the right combination of abilities, this actually becomes really powerful, especially with lethal hits, right? You throw lethal hits on it, or sustained hits on it. You throw a Court of the Archon to get lethals base. Or excuse me, you won't get lethals if it's inside, but, you know, you're getting lethal hits with the stratagem, possibly sustained hits if you wanted, if the mat's better on that. You can have Kabalite warriors in there. You can have the shooting from the Court of the Archon in there as well. It can actually punch up significantly, do a lot of damage, and it can advance, shoot, and charge, right? I mean, that's the other stratagem you can use. So if you're willing to put all your CP and all your kind of buffs and stuff into the Tantalus to just absolutely wreck some stuff, then it's solid. It's good. I don't think it's good for the points. Don't get me wrong, because it's very fragile and it's very, you know, you could very easily be killed. But, you know, it does do a lot of damage, and I think that's worth something in its own right. Okay. Let's talk about the Talos and the other Homunculus Koven units. So the Talos is S tier in this detachment. I think it's better in this detachment than Real Space Raid. In Real Space Raid, the only thing it really gets, -1 to wound via a stratagem. In this detachment, you can give it sustained hits, right? For those epic haywire, you know, haywire of doom salvos. You can give it advanced shoot and charge, which is one of the huge weaknesses of the Talos, that it's so slow. It's movement 7. It's a flying monster. It can't even move over ruins because it has such slow movement. It really needs to advance, and then it can't shoot. It can't charge after it advances. So being able to advance, shoot, and charge is absolutely chef's kiss on this thing. I think it's absolutely beautiful. I think you want at least 2 units of 2 Talos in this army, if not 3. That's how much I love them in this detachment. I think 3 is probably overkill, but definitely 2 units of them. You got twin-link liquefier guns, you got twin-linked haywire, and that's the other thing about it. It's detachment independent. You don't need the rerolls from this detachment to make it good, because it's already rerolling all of its dice anyway, and once it kills something, it's permanently empowered. So I think there's nothing better for the points in this detachment, to be honest. Dark Eldar do need some tough stuff on the field to be able to survive, and the Talos are going to be your answer to a lot of the enemy's issues and big threats. Okay, next up is the Grotesques. Grotesques, believe it or not, I know, right? A tier. Why? Why are Grotesques A tier all of a sudden? Well, I think the problem again with Grotesques is they're slow, they don't hit hard, and I think this detachment solves that. Giving them rerolls 1s to hit and to wound. Remember, all these guys have liquefier guns. So rerolls 1s to wound isn't that bad on their shooting, and then they get to charge afterward with that stratagem, rerolling 1s to hit, or with the pain token all hits, and then rerolling 1s to wound on the charge. Of course, you're going to have to make sure the wager is in their favor. They're going to have to be losing the wager in the combat phase, just like any other unit in this detachment. But potentially, they're doing a really good job at killing stuff. They're a great Overwatch threat because, God, 6 liquefier guns, are you joking me? Can do a ton of damage to infantry, and they're pretty durable. You know, they're not the most durable, but they're pretty durable. I still think you should be able to attach a homunculus to them, but unfortunately you can't do that. I was really hoping for that ability. I guess you're going to have to, well, I guess we're going to have to wait until the codex comes out for it. But yeah, this is a really strong unit in this detachment. And again, you give them sustained hits, you give them lethal hits, and they're hitting much harder than they should. So I do really like these guys. I like Talos better, don't get me wrong, but I still like these guys for mid-board, you know, fighting and mid-board control. Okay, next up is Rax. And they're B tier. I mean, you're going to probably have some in your army for, like I said, for pain tokens. I have kind of come to the understanding that I don't need them in this detachment for an extra pain token, but you can definitely use them for that in this. There's nothing wrong with it in this detachment. I just don't really find them that useful. I haven't had a single game with them in, I'd probably say, the last 10 games that I've played with Rax. They've just kind of done nothing. They've just given me a pain token. I had one unit score some secondary points a couple times. Like, that's basically all they do. And I feel like anything can really do that. Like, I could have a unit of 5 Kabalite warriors or 5 witches do the same thing. And yeah, they're not getting me a pain token after they die, but they're just something I already have in my army anyway, right? I don't have to spend extra points for it. So, yeah, I'm not the biggest fan of racks right now, personally, but, they're okay. They're not terrible. And they're kind of cheap now at 55 points. So, they're affordable. That's kind of what I'll say about them. The Chronos, I think, is just better than racks because, if you can afford a squad of racks, take a Chronos, A tier. A tier for a couple reasons. It can't be S tier because it's a support unit and it really doesn't. It's a 50-50 on whether or not you're going to regen pain tokens from this thing. You also have to have it within 9 inches of, your units using pain tokens, which isn't hard, don't get me wrong, but sometimes you're not going to be in range of everything you want to be. But the thing about this that's great is that it's tougher than a unit of racks. It's harder to kill. It can score secondary objectives very easily. It has good shooting, unlike the racks. The rack shooting sucks. I know some people like it. I don't. The weapons are too different. It's like you're trying to split fire too many different things with the racks because you have the hex rifle and you have the liquefier gun and they want to shoot at completely different targets. And it's really awkward and weird. You're usually just using them for objectives anyway. The Chronos, it's less points than the racks. It's more durable than the racks. It gives you a support ability which regens pain tokens, again, essentially doing the same thing racks are doing when they die. And it's smaller, it's kind of a smaller model in a weird way. Its base is, well, I would say probably, never mind, probably about the same size as racks if you cluster them all together. But for some reason, I just find this thing easier to hide, just easier to place. And yeah, I just love the little crony. I love the little chrono. So A tier for sure. And it actually gets good bonuses from the rerolls once to hit and wound in this detachment as well. Okay, on to the Incubi. Incubi, S tier. And again, rerolls ones to hit, rerolls ones to wound. If they're with an Archon, they're rerolling everything, but if they're with Drazhar, they're getting +1 to wound. They're just a really hard-hitting unit. They can get lethal hits. I think really that's what was missing before from these guys is the ability to get something like lethal hits, so you get for sure damage. Like, okay, if you charge into something with these guys, you're guaranteed to get damage off. I think they're a little bit better by themselves in this detachment, actually, than they are in Sky Splinter as well. I think if you add in the Archon and Incubi together are better in Sky Splinter, but just the Incubi alone, without the Archon, better in this detachment, especially with Drazhar. I think they're just amazing. And they do the same thing. They kill infantry, they kill heavy infantry, they kill bikes, they kill, even vehicles they can kill with lethal hits if they want to. They hit really hard, they force battle shock, they get you pain tokens. They're an amazing unit. Enough said. Incubi are still good. Okay. Next up is Scourges. Scourges are S tier, easily. There's 2 builds that you can do with them in this detachment. There is the Haywire Madness build, which is 4 Haywires, rerolling hits, giving them sustained hits, so that basically every 6 that you roll is going to double your attack. That's amazing. And then, of course, you can give them Dark Lances, which is also still good with sustained hits. But it's just not as peak, I think, as Haywire. And I think with the Dark Lances are needed, but yeah, I mean, sometimes you're going to want Dark Lances, I'm going to be honest. I have Dark Lances in a couple of my lists just because I have so much Haywire in my list that I want to be able to make sure that if I go into monsters, like demons, new demons or something like that, I have something that can deal with them. But yeah, Haywires are really good with these guys, especially with sustained hits stratagem. Dark Lancers are good with sustained hits. These guys are amazing. And of course, move, shoot, move. It doesn't matter if they're 130 points. They're going to stay alive for most of the game against a lot of opponents. I think their one weakness is probably indirect fire, but even so, because they have deep strike, that's not that big of a deal. Alright, let's talk about Kabbalite Warriors. Kabbalite Warriors, A tier. They're really good in this detachment as well. They're basically a standard in every detachment, though. I like them in this one, though, because they can get rerolls ones to wound, which is useful with several of their weapons just being poison. So that is good. You can give them the Archon, so they could just reroll all hits and wounds anyway, which make them detachment independent, which you do need some of those units. And I like these guys because of the ability to give an Archon the Arc Raider enhancement and just have these guys sticky to objectives right off the bat, right? Like, you can scout these guys up, they can sticky something, and then you can have the squad of 5 just on the home objective, sticky the home objective. And on turn 1, you could potentially have 2 sticky objectives right away. I think that's really good. And yeah, I absolutely love this unit. They're really powerful. Okay, let's talk about Mandrakes. Mandrakes are just going to be A tier because they're good, right? They don't necessarily benefit from the detachment bonus, although rerolls once hit and wound doesn't hurt. But in essence, they're just one of those units that's going to be scoring you objectives most of the time, screening, stuff like that. But they are pretty good, and I would say they're better in this detachment than other detachments as well. So yeah, A tier unit all the way. And they have Infiltrate. So of course that's great. You do need an infiltration unit in this army as well. So, there we go. Alright, let's talk about the Harlequin units. Now, to make this detachment truly work, you do need Harlequins, and you do need Harlequins that hit very hard. So, let's talk about the Troop Master first. Troop Master is an A tier unit easily. If you want to attach him to a troop, he is the only thing you should be attaching to them because he helps them hit harder. With rerolls 1s to hit and rerolls 1s to wound, they're doing a lot of damage on charge with dev wounds, with a ton of attacks. They get +1 to wound on the charge, so they're very easily a powerful melee unit. I don't use a troop in the lists that I have made with the Reaper's Wager, but you could easily argue that they are worth their points. I personally think they're worth their points. You do need to probably either use the... Well, I'd say one or two things, right? You could obviously have them infiltrate with the... I think it's called the Reaper's Cowl or the Shadow Cowl or something like that. Gives them infiltrate and stealth. You could do that. Or you could just put them in a Star Weaver. Either way, it's pretty good, and they hit pretty hard for their cost. So I really like the Troop Master. Definitely A tier. If you're bringing a troop, you need a Troop Master. Death Jester's next. I'm going to put him in A tier. I would have previously put him in like S tier, but after playing a couple games with him, the rerolls 1s to wound and hit is good, but with his sustained hits 3 ability, it's basically you have a 50% chance of getting a 6, and it's just not as good as the Fate's Messenger version, I have to say. It's good, but it's not as good, so, but here's the thing, though. It's important to have a Death Jester in this army anyway, because you need something that can be a lone op, that can score on objectives out in the open, or that can sit on your home objective and screen your backfield. You need something like that that also has a good range on its weapon to, threaten units downfield. So it is a requirement for the army, in my opinion, just how it works to have a Death Jester in there so you can get the bonuses of the Reaper's Wager. You could potentially finish something off to flip, to the other side of the wager. It's important. You do need something like a Death Jester in your list, and I do wholeheartedly think that. It's only 90 points, so it's not that many points, but yeah, is it as good as the Eldari version? No, it's not. But it's still pretty good, and it's still worth using. I think, honestly, the Eldari, me included, we've been spoiled by the Death Jester having the Fate's Messenger, realistically, right? Like, rerolls 1s to hit and rerolls 1s to wound is really good in and of itself, and even that feels terrible in response, in comparison, so, yeah. Anyway, good model, just not as good as in the Eldari Codex. Index, I should say. Okay, Shadowseer. Shadowseer's okay, B tier. I rated it D tier in Eldari just because it sucks in Eldari because you can't use it in a transport. But in this detachment, you can run them on foot. You could give the unit lethal hits. You can, I know advanced shoot and charge is already a thing, but having the Shadowseer can allow you to advance shoot and charge with 2 units or advance and charge with 2 units on the battlefield. So it's not terrible. I don't think it's great, but, rerolls 1 to hits, rerolls 1 to wound does help with the damage a little bit that the Shadowseer lacks, and the troop does get +1 to wound as well, so, it's not terrible. I just think it's probably on the lower end of... Actually, you know what? Yeah, I'll leave it in B tier. It's probably B minus tier, if that makes sense. B minus, C plus tier. I'll leave it in B, but it's probably more of a C with the homunculus. It just, I think it may be a little bit better than the homunculus, honestly, but it's not that much better. And I just think realistically, the only reason you'd use this is to have 2 units on the battlefield that can advance and charge in the same turn. Okay, let's talk about the Solitaire. And this is the reason why you don't take the Shadows here. Solitaire, easily S tier in this. It gets 12 attacks when it blitzes. You're rerolling ones to hit, so it hits on 2+, so you're rerolling all your misses. You can give it lethal hits, you can give it sustained hits, which give it even more attacks. You can also, of course, reroll ones to wound, and against most targets it's wounding on 3s, so it can still pack a punch against those targets as well. So yeah, Solitaire, very good, and probably quintessential to being able to run this army efficiently, just because it is a Harlequin unit that can easily flip the wager for you in the fight phase, so that you can then reroll your hits on stuff like Incubi, reroll your hits on stuff like Witches, right? Reroll your hits and wounds, flipping the wager so that your next Druhkari unit that's also in combat can get the benefit. Definitely love the Solitaire, and it's crucial in this list, I believe. And there were so many times, by the way, guys, in my games where I wanted to charge a Druhkari unit in, but they were winning the wager, and I was like, well, I didn't quite kill anything with Harlequin shooting, so I was like, okay, run in the Solitaire, fight with the Solitaire first, kill something, and then fight with, maybe Drazhar and the Incubi, which is actually exactly what I did. Luckily, my opponent didn't have the CP for counteroffensive, but I mean, even so, the unit that I picked up wasn't exactly a good combat unit, so that was fine. But you do have to be careful about that. Be careful about combat, or counteroffensive, I should say, and make sure that if you are going to use this combination to use the the Solitaire to charge into something, flip it for your next unit. Make sure you either have an Archon Warlord, your Warlord Archon in combat with Incubi, or make sure you have Drazhar with Incubi and you're not charging something that it will wreck you in return. Okay. Next up is the Harlequin Troop. The Harlequin Troop is A tier, just like the Troop Master and the Death Jester. If you take a Troop Master, you gotta take a Troop, and Troops are good. Rerolling ones to hit, rerolling ones to wound, potentially lethal hits, +1 to wound. They're a solid combat unit, and they do a lot of damage. They're not as hard-hitting as Incubi. They're not as hard-hitting as Witches with sustained hits and potentially lethal hits for the points, but they do some solid work anyway. Okay. And plus, they're a Harlequin unit, and sometimes, again, like I said, you either have a Solitaire charge in, or you have a Troop Master with a Troop charge in, who are currently losing. You can flip it, right, to make sure that the Harlequins are winning, and then the Druhkari are losing, and then you fight with the Druhkari. Alright. Skyweavers. Now, this may surprise some of you, because I thought these guys were banging at first. But after a couple games with them, they're B tier. And not because they didn't do well, it's just they didn't do as well as the Scourges. They didn't do as well as the Talos. The Talos were out haywiring the Skyweavers. And the combat of the Skyweavers isn't that good either for the points. So I was giving them Zephyr Glaives. I was using the shooting to, rerolls ones to hit and wound. They did okay. They did like maybe 6 wounds to a vehicle. And then they charged something and they wouldn't kill it. Even if there was a moment in the game, one of the games I played with this, where I charged into 2 heavy intercessors, just 2, and tried to finish them off with the Skyweavers, and just nothing. And I know, heavy intercessors are toughness 6. These guys are strength 5. Proxy hammer, what are you doing expecting to kill 2 heavy intercessors? Well, there's a lot of units that I could replace these guys with that could kill 2 intercessors, right? Heavy intercessors. A troop with a Troop Master is around the same cost as these guys. They're 115. I think they're 115. They might be 105. Excuse me, they're 105. But even so, Troop Master with Troop easily kills them. Incubi with an Archon or Drazhar easily kill them, right? There's things that easily kill them. So I just, realistically, I don't like them that much. They're not that good for the points. And really what it comes down to is just lack of damage, right? I think for the points, it's better to just have something else in your army that can actually dish out some good damage. I may be wrong, but I played them in a couple games. They didn't impress me in either game. They didn't make up their points worth in either game. And they seem like, it almost seems like it's a waste to use a stratagem on them even sometimes. Because it's like, yeah, I could advance, shoot, and charge, but I could do the same thing with Talos. I could do the same thing with something else in my army, right? I could do the same thing with Incubi. I could do the same thing with Scourges, right? I mean, they don't want to, obviously, they don't want to charge afterward, but you could still do the same thing to get a line of sight land on them, right? So, yeah, I just didn't find them that effective, to be honest. But let me know in the comments if you guys are a fan of these. Personally, I just didn't really like it, and for 10 more points, you can take a Void Weaver, which is just better, I think. So, anyway, let's go to the Star Weaver. The Star Weaver is a transfer of the Quins. Whoops. Doesn't belong in C tier, guys. It's A tier. I mean, it's good, right? It's a good transport. Allows them to hop back in. I think it's the same as the Venom. It's actually a little better than a Venom, to be honest. It's 10 more points, but it's more durable. It has smoke, I believe. You can pop smoke on it. 2 Shuriken Cannons. Shuriken Cannons are better than Venom Cannons, especially with rerolls 1 to hit and wound. So yeah, I think this is a better vehicle overall than the Venom. I would say this is almost S tier, but because it's a transport, I just can't feel myself putting it up there. But yeah, if you need to transport your Troop Master, your Quins, this is the thing. This is the thing you want in your list. Okay, last is the Void Reaver. And now the Void Reaver is S tier. I know. I know, guys. You're crazy, Proxy Hammer, for saying that. I'm going to go out on a limb and say it's S tier. I don't know if it's actually S tier, but it's good. I played a couple of games with it. It didn't disappoint. There were times where I would shoot at something, and by the way, because Armor of Contempt is now only once, there was several times where I would just shoot with this to cause a battle shock right away, and force my opponent to use Armor of Contempt, or lose it on that unit potentially lose it on that unit for the entire phase. So this is what you do, guys. Because Armor of Contempt can only be used once now, you shoot with this thing first. Preferably, you'd be losing the wager at the time. You get to reroll ones to hit and wound, which scares a lot of Marine players into thinking they need to use Armor of Contempt. And they will use Armor of Contempt, because if they don't use it, they will lose it on that model, right? Because of Battle Shock. And yes, Battle Shock, you mostly pass it, but there is a good, decent chance that you fail it, and a lot of players don't want to risk that. So they just use Armor of Contempt right away, and, you know, you do some damage to the vehicle or whatever, and then you just stuff it with other stuff. And the other great thing about this is Haywire doesn't care about Armor of Contempt anyway, and if your opponent doesn't also pop smoke right away, then you could just riddle your opponent's vehicle with Haywire. So this model did a lot of work for me. It did a lot of work with its shooting. It did good work with its battle shock. In the games I played, it usually didn't live past turn 3, but it shot a couple times, dealt a few battle shocks to enemy units. Usually they'd fail one of those, and I'd get a pain token from it, which was really good. And then that unit wouldn't be able to use stratagems, which was also really cool. And I played a couple games with it, and it did good, guys. And I think they're actually so good that I might take 2 of them in my list. I was actually considering getting rid of the Death Jester for one of them, but then I was like, well, I kind of need a lone op, so I'm going to have to rework my list a little bit to fit another one in, but I think they're really strong, and I think if you give them a chance, you'll find that they're actually pretty good with the Prismatic Cannon. Rerolls ones to hit and rerolls ones to wound is super effective. I know it's not as good as a reroll to hit and a reroll to wound in the Eldari one, but I guess the benefit of being in this detachment is you can also give it lethal hits from its Shuriken Cannons, so its Shuriken Cannons can actually do some decent damage in the early game against tough targets. So, yeah, there is that as well. Okay, so that's all I'll say about the Void Weaver. Obviously, it's also pretty tough with a 4-up invul and smoke that you can pop on it, but you don't always have that much CP to use. So, yeah, you're probably not going to use smoke on it, but it is good, and it surprised me. Let's just say that. However, you know, in the point of fairness, I will say it's probably more of an A tier unit. It's definitely more of an A tier unit. I'm putting it in S tier because I just felt like it did so much better than I thought it was going to do, and it really synergized really well with the rest of my army. Okay, that's going to be it for the tier list. So yeah, that's where it stands. Most of the units in this detachment are really good. And by the way, guys, look at this. Look at how many units are A and S tier that wouldn't have been normally. I guarantee you no one's putting Hellions in A tier with the Druhkari, but all of a sudden in Reaper's Wager, S tier. Grotesques, no one's saying that they're an A tier unit, but they're an A tier unit in Reaper's Wager because Reaper's Wager is an awesome detachment. I mean, there are some losers, don't get me wrong, but I mean, even the worst of the worst is still B. I mean, Ravagers are still okay, you know, Reavers are still okay. These units probably would have been memes. I mean, I could see the Tantalus being in C tier normally, but because it's in Reaper's Wager, it's in B tier. Court of the Archon. I don't like Court of the Archon, by the way, but I think it has potential in this detachment, which is why it's in B tier. Yeah, I don't know. What else can I say, right? I mean, this detachment is probably the best Druhkari detachment overall. If you want to take a balanced force with a lot of different types of units, this is the detachment for you. And there's also some insane trickery. I mean, come on. The Beastmaster with Infiltrate? Come on, guys. That's awesome. It may not be super competitive, but Infiltrate and Scouts with a Beast unit? I think that's something worth looking into. And actually, I'm going to try it in one of my next games and see how good it is. I mean, I could see people really just trying to hard screen this out, but if your opponent can't screen it, then it can just block your entire opponent's movement phase turn one. That would be insane, right? Hellions can absolutely dominate anything. Talos are really good in this detachment. You know, being able to advance, shoot, and charge is just so good on Talos. It's so good. It almost makes me think that they overlooked the beauty of the Talos in this detachment when they were like, oh, this is all about Harlequins and Dark Eldar units. And then they were like, oh, wait a second. Homunculus Koven units are excellent in this detachment. Whew. Damn. So yeah, I'm really excited about this. I'm excited to play more games on it. I'm trying to actually get some games on TTS coming up this next week as well. So yeah, if you guys are part of the Discord and you want to hit me up on TTS for, you know, a couple of, I may not be able to play a full game in all one setting, but if you want to play a game with me over the course of, you know, maybe 2-3 days, that would be awesome. I'm definitely down to do that. Okay, everybody, that's going to be it for today's video. Thanks for watching once again. We got more content coming later this week. We got a Ynnari video coming out on how the Ynnari can use the Armored Warhost attachment, which the more I think about it is super disappointing with regular Eldar, but with Ynnari it might have some teeth. We're also going to be doing some, you know, hopefully some kind of hobby updates later this month where I show you guys what I've been working on over the past couple months with my army. So stay tuned for that. If you do want to support the channel and want to become a patron, I will leave the link in the description, and that will grant you permanent access to our Discord community, which is a great community of Eldar players and enthusiasts who love talking about strategy, tactics, and of course, hobby. We also have a channel store page, which has a bunch of cool Eldar-inspired apparel on it. Check it out. We also are going to have an Amazon affiliate link in the description as well if you want to grab some discounted Eldar minis. Alright everybody, that's going to be it for today's video. Thank you so much for watching once again, and I will see you guys next time. Have a good one, everybody. Peace out.